June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. A single submarine sits submerged, 300 feet below the surface. Inside, 72 men are holding their breath. Above them, 3 Japanese destroyers are dropping depth charges, hunting them. The submarine's hull groans under the pressure. Cork insulation rains from the ceiling. Light bulbs shatter. This is the USS Cavalla. And just 90 minutes ago, she accomplished something extraordinary. She sank the Shokaku, one of the 6 aircraft carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor. The same carrier that had survived every major battle in the Pacific War was now at the bottom of the ocean, taking 1,272 men with her. But here's what makes this story remarkable. Cavalla was on her first war patrol. Her crew had never fired a torpedo in combat before this day. And the attack they just pulled off? It would help decide the entire Pacific War. This is the story of how one submarine in the right place at the right time helped turn the tide of World War II. To understand what happened on June 19, 1944, you need to rewind to December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers launched the attack that brought America into World War II. 2,403 Americans died. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was devastated. 2 of those carriers were the Shokaku and her sister ship, Zuikaku. They were the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, 29,800 tons, 872 feet long, carrying 72 aircraft each, fast, modern, deadly. For the next 2 years, Shokaku fought in nearly every major battle. The Coral Sea, the Solomon Islands, the Santa Cruz Islands. She was a survivor. But by mid-1944, Japan was losing, badly. The U.S. had captured the Gilbert Islands, then the Marshall Islands, and on June 15, 1944, American forces invaded Saipan in the Mariana Islands, just 1,500 miles from Tokyo. This wasn't just another island. If the U.S. captured Saipan, they could base B-29 Superfortress bombers there. Bombers that could reach Japan itself. Japan's leadership knew this was it. Their last chance to reverse the war. So they launched Operation Ago, a massive fleet operation designed to destroy the American carrier force once and for all. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Japanese mobile fleet. 9 aircraft carriers, 5 battleships, including the legendary Yamato, 13 cruisers, 28 destroyers. On paper, it was impressive. But there were problems. The pilot problem. The experienced aviators who attacked Pearl Harbor? Most were dead. Their replacements had 200 flying hours compared to 800 plus for American pilots. The fuel problem. American submarines had destroyed so much of Japan's merchant fleet that they couldn't transport refined fuel anymore. Ozawa's ships were running on crude oil pumped directly from Borneo, thick, sulfurous sludge that clogged engines and produced black smoke visible for miles. The intelligence problem. What Ozawa didn't know was that American codebreakers had intercepted his plans. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding the submarine force, knew the Japanese were coming, and he positioned his submarines directly in their path. 4 submarines formed a scouting line, the NA line, USS Albacore, USS Bang, USS Finback, USS Stingray. But there was another submarine nearby, one that wasn't part of Lockwood's careful plan, one that was about to make history entirely by accident. USS Cavalla. The USS Cavalla was commissioned on February 29, 1944, just 4 months before our story begins. She was a Gato-class submarine, 312 feet long, displacing 1,526 tons. She could dive to 400 feet, make 20 knots on the surface, 8 knots submerged. Her armament? 10 21-inch torpedo tubes and 24 torpedoes. Each torpedo carried a 643-pound Torpex warhead, enough to break a ship in half. Her commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kostler, 36 years old, from Ohio. This was his first command. On May 31, 1944, Cavalla departed Pearl Harbor for her first war patrol. The crew, 72 men, most of whom had never been in combat. Their assignment? Patrol east of the Philippines. Watch for Japanese shipping. Report enemy movements. It seemed routine. The first 2 weeks were uneventful. Cavalla transited westward across the Pacific. The crew settled into the monotonous rhythm of submarine life. 4 hours on watch, 8 hours off. Surface at night to charge batteries. Submerge during the day to avoid aircraft. On June 8th, they hit a whale. The boat shuddered. Blood appeared in their wake, but no damage. They kept going. Then on June 14th, they sailed into a typhoon, 15-foot waves. The submarine pitched violently. Men were thrown from their bunks. Several got seasick. Kostler took the boat down to ride out the storm underwater. But on June 15th, everything changed. The radio operator intercepted a message from another submarine, USS Flying Fish. Flying Fish had spotted a Japanese task force moving east at high speed, major fleet units, moving toward the Marianas. Kostler immediately changed course to intercept. He pushed Cavalla to 17 knots, racing toward the reported position. He coordinated with another submarine, USS Pipefish. They searched all night. Nothing. By dawn on June 16th, Kostler had to admit defeat. The Japanese task force had either changed course or outrun them. But then, just before midnight on June 16th, radar contact. Multiple ships, southwest, moving at moderate speed. Kostler identified what looked like a convoy, 2 large ships, possibly tankers, escorted by 3 or 4 destroyers. For the next 3 hours, Cavalla tried to attack. But the Japanese escorts were good, really good. They constantly changed course, pinging with active sonar. Every time Kostler got into firing position, a destroyer would turn directly toward them, forcing Cavalla to dive deep and evade. At 2 a.m., a destroyer charged straight at them. Kostler ordered an emergency dive to 300 feet. The crew heard the destroyer's screws pass directly overhead. They waited in silence. When they finally surfaced, the convoy was gone. Kostler didn't know it, but those tankers were fleet oilers supporting Ozawa's carriers. If he'd sunk them, the entire Japanese operation might have been called off due to fuel shortage. Sometimes the attacks that fail matter as much as the ones that succeed. On June 17th, new orders arrived from Pearl Harbor. Admiral Lockwood was repositioning submarines based on intelligence reports. Cavalla was ordered to a new position, 13 degrees north, 137 degrees east, approximately 350 miles west of Guam. Kostler changed course immediately. At 7:45 p.m. on June 17th, the radar operator reported a faint contact. Bearing 290 degrees. Range, 30,000 yards, nearly 15 miles. The contact kept appearing and disappearing on the radar screen. It was at extreme range. Kostler ordered a course change to close. As the range decreased, more contacts appeared. First 2, then 4, then 7. By 8:15 p.m., Kostler was certain. This was a major Japanese task force. The radar returns showed at least 7 large vessels. They were moving at 19 knots, zigzagging on a base course of 045 degrees, heading toward the Marianas. Through careful plotting, Kostler identified what appeared to be at least 1 aircraft carrier, several possible battleships or heavy cruisers, and multiple destroyers. This was the big one, the Japanese fleet everyone was looking for. Now Kostler faced an impossible decision. His submarine was in perfect position to attack. The Japanese were heading straight toward him. A spread of torpedoes could damage or sink a capital ship. This was what every submarine commander dreamed of. But Kostler also knew something else. Admiral Spruance's fleet needed to know where the Japanese were. The location, composition, and course of this force was potentially more valuable than any ship Cavalla could sink alone. After consulting with his executive officer, Kostler made the harder choice. He would surface and transmit a contact report, then try to attack. Surfacing near enemy warships violated every instinct in submarine warfare. But the stakes were too high. At 9:45 p.m., after the Japanese force had passed beyond visual range, Cavalla surfaced. The radio operator began transmitting. Large enemy task force latitude. 13 degrees north longitude, 136 degrees 30 minutes east, base course 045 speed. 19 knots composition. At least 1 carrier, several battleships or cruisers, multiple destroyers. The message was received at Pearl Harbor and immediately relayed to Admiral Spruance aboard USS Indianapolis. This was the first definitive confirmation of the Japanese fleet's position. Spruance now knew a major engagement was coming. After transmitting, Cavalla submerged and tried to catch up to the Japanese fleet. But it was hopeless. The surface ships were too fast. By dawn on June 18th, Kostler gave up the chase and returned to his patrol position. The crew was disappointed. They'd found the Japanese fleet but couldn't attack. Little did they know their biggest moment was less than 24 hours away. Dawn, June 19, 1944. Cavalla was submerged at periscope depth, maintaining her assigned patrol position. The crew ran through routine maintenance. Nobody expected what was coming. At 3:45 a.m., a low-flying aircraft roared directly over the submarine. The officer of the deck barely had time to sound the diving alarm before the plane passed overhead. Cavalla crash-dived. The crew waited for bombs. None came. Either the aircraft hadn't seen them, or it had no weapons. As the sun rose, Cavalla returned to periscope depth. And that's when things got interesting. What Kostler didn't know was that the night's fleet movements had placed his submarine directly in the path of Ozawa's main carrier force. The Japanese admiral, still believing his position was secret, had launched his first airstrike against the American carriers at 8:30 a.m. Now, as those aircraft departed, the Japanese carriers turned into the wind to recover their combat air patrol and prepare for the next launch. They were heading straight toward Cavalla. At 10:48 a.m., the sound operator reported high-speed screws, bearing 070 degrees. Kostler raised the periscope for a brief look. On the horizon, the distinctive pagoda-style masts of Japanese warships. "Battle station submerged," Kostler ordered. The crew rushed to their combat positions. Torpedo room crews checked their weapons. The diving officer fine-tuned the boat's trim. The plotting party prepared the firing solution. At 10:52 a.m., Kostler made his second periscope observation. And what he saw took his breath away. A large aircraft carrier, accompanied by at least one heavy cruiser and several destroyers. Distance, 12,000 yards, about 6 miles. The carrier was recovering aircraft. Planes circled overhead, waiting to land. The flight deck was crowded with aircraft that had already landed, wings still extended. The carrier was making about 20 knots, and its course would bring it much closer. Kostler had to maneuver Cavalla into firing position without being detected by the screening destroyers. He could only afford brief periscope observations. The escorts were actively searching for submarines. For the next 15 minutes, it was a delicate dance. The TDC operator, the torpedo data computer, continuously updated the firing solution based on Kostler's observations and the sound bearings from sonar. At 11:10 a.m., Kostler raised the periscope again. The carrier was now at 5,000 yards and closing. The angle was nearly perfect for a broadside shot. But there was a problem. A destroyer, the Yurikaze, was moving into a position that would block the torpedo run. Kostler had seconds to decide: wait for the destroyer to clear and risk losing the shot, or fire now and hope the destroyer didn't interfere? At 11:18 a.m., with the carrier at 1,200 yards, Kostler made his decision. Fire 1. The first torpedo left tube number 1 with a shudder and a hiss of high-pressure air. 8 seconds later, Fire 2. 8 more seconds. Fire 3. Fire 4. Fire 5. Fire 6. 6 torpedoes, spreading in a fan pattern, set to run at 15 feet depth. "Take her deep," Kostler ordered immediately. "Flood negative. Full dive on the bow planes." Cavalla's bow pointed sharply downward. Tons of water flooded into the negative tank. The submarine was passing 100 feet when... boom! The first torpedo hit. A deep, satisfying explosion that resonated through the water. 8 seconds later, boom. The second hit. Then boom. The third. 3 hits out of 6 torpedoes. Against a maneuvering target, that was excellent. But the celebration was short-lived. 2 minutes after firing, the first depth charges exploded above them. The Japanese escorts had traced back the torpedo wakes. Now they were hunting Cavalla. "Rig for silent running." The order passed through the submarine in whispers. All non-essential equipment shut down. The air conditioning stopped. Men removed their shoes, moving in stocking feet. Cavalla passed 300 feet, approaching her test depth. A pattern of 6 depth charges detonated close enough to shake the submarine violently. Cork insulation rained from the ceiling. Light bulbs shattered. The hull groaned under the pressure waves. The temperature inside the submarine began rising. Without air conditioning, it would soon become unbearable. At 11:35 a.m., another pattern, this one even closer. Men stood at their stations, sweating profusely, breathing shallowly to conserve oxygen. The air was getting stale. Carbon dioxide levels rose, headaches, nausea. At 11:44 a.m., the sound operator reported a destroyer passing directly overhead. The crew could hear it, the rhythmic thrashing of the escort's screws growing louder, reaching a crescendo, then fading. Everyone braced for depth charges. Nothing. Either the destroyer had lost contact, or it was repositioning. Kostler used this moment to change course, hoping to slip away. For the next 2 hours, Cavalla played a desperate game of evasion. Kostler varied depth between 250 and 400 feet, changed course frequently but gradually, used temperature gradients in the water to hide from Japanese sonar. The depth charging continued, patterns detonating at various distances. Japanese records would later show that 105 depth charges were dropped. 56 exploded close enough to Cavalla to cause damage. But the submarine's construction held. The crew's training held. By 1 p.m., the sound operator reported only one destroyer remaining nearby. The others had apparently returned to escort the damaged carrier. Then at 1:32 p.m., a series of strange noises came from the direction of the attack. Breaking up noises, the sound operator reported. The characteristic sound of a ship's hull collapsing under pressure. The groaning, cracking sound of metal failing. These noises continued for the next half hour. Then at 2:08 p.m., 4 tremendous explosions shook Cavalla despite the distance. These weren't depth charges. They were far more powerful. The carrier's ammunition magazines, or her aviation fuel bunkers, detonating. The Shokaku was dying. Let's talk about what was happening aboard the Shokaku. When Kostler's torpedoes hit, the carrier was in the worst possible situation. She was refueling and rearming aircraft. Aviation fuel lines were open. Ammunition was being moved. The first torpedo struck amidships, tearing a massive hole and flooding the No. 3 boiler room. The second hit forward, destroying aviation fuel bunkers. Fires started immediately among the aircraft on the hangar deck. The third torpedo struck near the forward elevator, jamming it in the raised position. Thousands of tons of water poured through the holes in the hull. The carrier took a severe list to starboard. Captain Matsubara Hiroshi ordered counterflooding to correct the list. But this only reduced the ship's buoyancy. Within minutes, Shokaku had slowed to 12 knots. Damage control parties fought the flooding and fires. For a while, they seemed to be winning. The initial flooding was contained. Some fires were extinguished, but the structural damage was too severe. The torpedo hits had damaged fuel lines and ventilation systems. Aviation gasoline vapors, heavier than air, accumulated in the lower compartments. At approximately 2 p.m., these vapors reached an ignition source. The explosion was catastrophic. It tore through Shokaku's interior, destroying what remained of her watertight integrity. The blast lifted the armored flight deck several feet, sending aircraft and crew members flying. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition cooked off in the heat. Captain Matsubara ordered abandon ship at 2:10 p.m., but many crew members were already trapped below decks. The carrier's list increased rapidly to 45 degrees. Men slid down the canted flight deck into the water. The destroyers Urikaze and light cruiser Yahagi moved in to rescue survivors, throwing lines and life rings. At 3:01 p.m., Shokaku capsized to starboard and sank stern first. As she went down, more explosions erupted from within her hull, boilers contacting cold seawater, remaining ammunition detonating. The carrier that had attacked Pearl Harbor was gone. Of her crew of 1,663 officers and men, 1,272 perished, including Captain Matsubara, who went down with his ship. Approximately 570 survivors were rescued. Back aboard Cavalla, the crew didn't know the full extent of what they'd accomplished. By 3 p.m., the submarine's battery was nearly exhausted. The air inside was barely breathable. Carbon dioxide levels had risen to dangerous levels. Kostler decided to come to periscope depth. To his relief, the periscope revealed empty ocean. The Japanese escorts had departed. At 7 p.m., after more than 7 hours submerged, Cavalla surfaced. The crew immediately started the diesel engines. Fresh air flooded into the submarine. Men stumbled topside, gulping clean ocean air. The temperature inside had reached 125 degrees Fahrenheit. Kostler's first priority was reporting the attack to Pearl Harbor. Attacked Shokaku-class carrier 3 hits, observed heavy explosions heard after going deep, believed target sank. The message was received with jubilation at submarine headquarters. Admiral Lockwood himself replied, "Well done, Cavalla, her achievement beyond expectations." But here's what makes June 19, 1944 even more significant. Cavalla's attack on Shokaku was only half the story. At 8:10 a.m. that same morning, 3 hours before Cavalla's attack, another submarine, USS Albacore, had torpedoed the Japanese flagship Taiho. Taiho was Japan's newest, largest carrier, and she sank at 2:32 p.m., 29 minutes before Shokaku went down. In a single day, Japan lost 2/3 of its fleet carrier strength. Taiho and Shokaku represented the core of Ozawa's striking power. But the losses didn't stop there. That same day, in the air battle over the Marianas, American pilots shot down 244 of 374 Japanese aircraft launched. American losses: 20 aircraft. The battle was so one-sided that American aviators nicknamed it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan's naval aviation would never recover from June 19, 1944. The experienced pilots, already scarce, were now almost completely gone. The carriers, already limited, were decimated. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was over, and it was a crushing American victory. Let's step back and look at what this meant for the war. Before June 19th, Japan still had a functioning carrier force. It was weakened, yes, but it could still theoretically conduct offensive operations. After June 19th, that capability was gone. Permanently. The mobile fleet limped back to Japan. Ozawa had started with 9 carriers. He returned with 7, but they were essentially useless without aircraft or trained pilots. The loss of Shokaku was particularly symbolic. She was one of the last surviving carriers from the Pearl Harbor attack force. Her sister ship, Zuikaku, would survive only 4 more months before being sunk during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. But beyond the symbolism, the strategic implications were enormous. With the Japanese Navy effectively neutralized, the U.S. could proceed with island-hopping operations without fear of major fleet engagements. The Philippines would be liberated. Iwo Jima would be captured. Okinawa would be invaded. All of these operations became possible because of what happened on June 19, 1944. And a significant part of that day's success belonged to USS Cavalla and her 72-man crew. Cavalla continued her patrol for another 6 weeks. She would complete 5 more war patrols during the war, sinking 3 additional vessels. But nothing would match the achievement of June 19, 1944. Lieutenant Commander Kostler was awarded the Navy Cross, the Navy's second-highest decoration for valor. Cavalla received the Presidential Unit Citation for her first patrol, the highest unit award in the U.S. military. Kostler would later become the only submarine commander to sink a capital ship from the original Pearl Harbor attack force. Interestingly, there's a footnote to this story. Before the war, intelligence officer Jasper Holmes had bet Kostler a bottle of scotch that he would sink a Japanese carrier. After Cavalla's attack, Holmes still owed Kostler that bottle. The broader submarine war statistics are staggering. American submarines comprised less than 2% of U.S. Navy personnel but accounted for 55% of all Japanese maritime losses. They sank 201 warships totaling 540,000 tons and 1,113 merchant vessels totaling 4.9 million tons. This systematic destruction of Japan's merchant marine effectively strangled the island empire, cutting off vital resources and isolating outlying garrisons. After the war, Cavalla continued to serve until 1969. She was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1982. Today, you can visit her at Seawolf Park in Galveston, Texas. You can walk through her narrow compartments, peer through the same periscope Kostler used to target Shokaku, and stand in the control room where life and death decisions were made. The submarine stands as a tangible reminder of what happened in the Philippine Sea in June 1944. As for the Shokaku herself, her wreck has never been found. She lies somewhere in the deep waters of the Philippine Sea, her exact location still unknown. For the families of the 1,272 men who went down with her, the lack of a known gravesite remains a source of grief. War creates these kinds of tragedies. The Japanese sailors aboard Shokaku weren't villains. They were professionals doing their duty as they understood it. Many were barely out of their teens. Their deaths, while necessary in the context of total war, represent 1,272 individual tragedies. But the story of Cavalla and Shokaku reminds us of something important about naval warfare. Sometimes a single submarine with a determined crew can change the course of history. On June 19, 1944, 72 American submariners did exactly that. If you want to learn more about submarine warfare in the Pacific, check out the video we made about how Americans destroyed the Japanese Navy at Midway. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe. We're trying to cross 1,000 subscribers by the end of the month, and we're over 8% there. Until next time, I'm Naim, and I'll see you in the next one.